Good evening, everyone. The time is right. We will still have people joining us for the meeting, but I will have to keep the meeting to time. So please allow me to welcome you to the third webinar in the series on artificial intelligence and machine learning in medicine, organized by the International Organization for Medical Physics. My name is Eva Bezak, and I will be the moderator for the meeting. Tonight, we have a wonderful panel of speakers from Australia who will be sharing their experiences in a number of areas, from examples in radiation oncology and nuclear medicine, how machine learning can be used, including how a multidisciplinary collaboration needs to be established for successful implementation of machine learning. The short presentations will be followed by panel discussions. So our first speaker will be Dr. Johan Verjans, and without much ado, I will hand over to him. Johan, could you be so kind and start sharing your screen and unmute your microphone? At the same time, I would like to ask all the participants to mute their microphones and disable their cameras to ensure that we are not overloading the bandwidth for the presentation. Johan is a cardiologist from the Netherlands and currently working in Adelaide, Australia. And he's also a deputy director for the Machine Learning Institute here in Adelaide. Johan, over to you.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you for the kind invitation. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's getting pretty late here, but I'm really happy to present to this big audience from all over the world. Today, my presentation is fairly new because I understand that you have heard a lot about machine learning and the basic principles that I usually talk about. But today, I will share with you a little bit about my journey in Adelaide, how we have established medical machine learning in Adelaide, or further established, and maybe you can learn something from this in this short presentation. So without explaining anything about machine learning, I think the key elements to start with machine learning projects is to have four important elements. One is clinical patient data, one is large-scale biomedical data, and not only ideas and data, but also access to data, and also clean data. Other data that are interesting, in my opinion, are sensor data for health and environmental data that can help predict different diseases. And to make sense of all this growing amount of data, we cannot go without AI, as you probably heard, in the future. Not for every problem, but for a lot of problems, we will get help from AI. So in Adelaide, we have research institutes, hospitals, and universities, and also centers of excellence in sensing. We have also a new center for proton therapy, the first one in the Southern Hemisphere, that also has a group that is active in machine learning, all with the goal to improve diagnosis, prognosis, but also more and more we're looking at healthcare processes, how to improve and speed up things and save costs. A crucial element for this, this whole process, obviously, is machine learning expertise. When I came to Adelaide, and I'll speak a little bit about the Institute of Machine Learning, I noticed that most people were engaged mostly in developing methods, and they have done that for decades, and they're really good at it. What was something that I had to discover is that actually applying these methods into medical problems, medical data sets or others, was not much of interest to a lot of the researchers. And that took a while to actually engage and increase that interest. And but as a result, there is still a real strong group in methods development in AI who help the applied scientists who go with real data sets to see if we can improve diagnosis of any or any medical problem. So a little bit about the Australian Institute for Machine Learning as one of the examples. Why am I fortunate to be there, and what was my vision to connect this decade-long expertise in AI to more medical precinct that had a $4 billion investment. It was one of 6 research institutes at the University of Adelaide. It's the largest machine learning group in Australia, 3rd in the world in publications in key conferences in computer vision. So that's a lot of expertise, and research teams are basically, there's no real focus. We do everything. So there's a lot of methods, but also a lot of defense, space, agriculture, and medical projects. We work with a lot of companies, and for example, Lockheed Martin is a foundation partner, and we work with small, medium, and large-size companies. We join, besides publishing computer vision papers and applied papers, we also join a lot of challenges that benchmark us compared to the rest of the world. And you don't have to read everything, but we're leading in driverless cars, object detection, space and mining challenges, productivity, but also more challenging AI in terms of reasoning and understanding and interacting with computers and applying this to medical projects. Commercialization expertise is also something that is really a bonus. So we've developed an FDA-approved first-in-class device that outperforms microbiologists for agar plate reading. We looked at bladder scanning to make a real 3D volume while scrolling through the bladder, and helped the company establish that. And this is a real cornerstone of medical machine learning projects. Location. We're very fortunate in Adelaide that we have one big street in Adelaide that has most of the universities. It's a long street, but it has the university, it has the Research Institute on your right here, and it has the Royal Adelaide Hospital, which is one of the most ambitious projects, one of the most expensive buildings in the world. That is 5 minutes by bicycle to the Institute for Machine Learning. So my job is also at all these institutes. So I'm an imaging cardiologist. I work 2 days in clinic to gather my clinical problems, but I also work in this biomedical research institute to push for omics integration into my imaging problems, because we like to predict imaging problems, because imaging is often very late, and I think we need some help from genomics and expression of genes in multiomics to improve our prediction and treatment. What is important, and that's why I said base here on the right top, is that if you employ people with computer science background, you shouldn't put them in a cardiology or radiation therapy department. You should put them with their peers, and they can roll their chair and not reinvent the wheel. So we have a base at the Machine Learning Institute, and we engage with the different institutes. Very important are people. People who have knowledge about all the different processes. In physics, obviously, this can be wide. In imaging, it can be knowledge of acquisition, reconstruction, post-processing, reporting, and now more recently interacting with your scanners. And for example, we have recruited Mark Jenkinson from Oxford, who's a Times highly cited researcher and helps us with neuroimaging, and is a physicist in background. So we're very fortunate to have him on the team, because you need not only statisticians, you need computer scientists, you need methods, computer scientists, applied computer scientists who have experience with medical data, physicists for different projects, and obviously the clinician or the healthcare worker who delivers data, who annotates data, really important, can have a whole discussion and a presentation about data acquisition and annotation, but all these aspects need to be covered. I'll share also a little bit the strategy that we followed when we had a small group that grew from 2, now 25 people in medical. And one of the key focus areas that we had, it was defining just general areas and also assign people who have interest in data science slash machine learning and also access to data. And once we had engaged with different projects, we actually made them ambassadors for a certain specialty. So we have people who we engage with in ophthalmology and surgery, in ICU data, in cardiology, in pulmonology, and all these different, and we tend to work with any university. We don't really mind as long as people are ambitious and are nice to work with and get things done. We're now in phase 2, but in phase 1 we just started a cool pilot projects by engaging with the physicians and using computer scientists' free time to start up some data, get some pilot data, and acquire a grant. In phase 2, we have now more ambassadors, people representing different specialties and that we work mostly with. And we are starting to see that some focus areas are really amenable to AI research and imaging research. And some people we just love to work with. And grants, and getting grants always is a catalyzer in this process. And we hope to go to phase 3 where we create centers of expertise where we can apply or the different sub specialties or maybe just the whole medical machine learning center. Engagement is really important. Individual meetings is cornerstone, but also just having workshops. What is AI? But workshops about cell segmentation in the Biomedical Research Institute, workshop about imaging in the hospital, and guest lectures will help this. And also connecting to the startup ecosystem. We're just next to the startup community. So on Friday afternoon, we actually join, have a beer on the bridge between the two buildings, and that helps also catalyze projects. Investors, companies, and government are really important, and we spend a lot of time engaging with them also to create awareness that also the government should start saving money using AI and by spending some money on AI, but you can save much more in my opinion. Storytelling is really important to recruit the best, share stories of successful colleagues and publication and awards, and also be proud of where you work, that you have a livable city in our case that is not as large as other big cities. Safety is now in a very issue, and weather was one factor that convinced me to have a hybrid clinician and research job as well. So in conclusion, it's all about the knowledge assets. It's about the physical assets and the networking assets, and to have fun and be ambitious what you're doing. And that's where I want to stop and thank you. And this is a view of the new BRAC Center with the Center for Proton Therapy. So we are intending to do more and more projects with all the data that will arise from this research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johan, for kickstarting tonight's webinar. Questions will be asked after all three speakers have delivered their presentations, including the panel discussions. Dear participants, feel free to type your questions into the chat, and I will be reading those questions to the presenters after their presentations. Our next presenter is Dr. Price Jackson, who is a senior medical physicist at the Peter McCallum Cancer Center, and he will be talking to us on expanding quantitative medicine through AI and automation. Price, over to you.
Thanks for that, Eva, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to be involved with this. This is really exciting for me to be a part of, and yeah, so I'm a medical physicist, a diagnostic physicist actually, but I work quite closely with our radiotherapy colleagues at Peter Mac. We're an oncology center in Melbourne, yeah, but just to say that this is an exciting opportunity, not just to speak in, but an exciting time to be working in kind of image analysis in general, because we're seeing through AI or machine learning or deep learning, whatever you want to call it, that we're kind of in the Wild West in terms of capabilities of this new computational tool. and it's opening a lot of doors for doing complex image analysis tasks or automation in things that were really difficult to hard code or try and do manually or sort of engage in manually at the start. So, I mean, the initial push for this obviously is going to be in things like replacing or supporting radiologists in doing computer-aided diagnosis, assisting with predicting outcomes for say like cancer by feeding in images of tumor, helping with those kind of diagnostic predictions. This, I think, is one of the areas that may be the slowest to develop, because we have to be very careful when we push ahead with this. We see this is definitely a very powerful tool, but we have to be very careful and keep in mind that these are statistically driven processes, and make sure that we have a very careful balance of our curated data, and that we understand everything that's going on in these kind of black box computations that occur inside the neural networks. But where I think it's really cool is that we are able to give ourselves new capabilities from imaging. So we can kind of train an algorithm to look at noisy CT scans and try and remove the presence of noise or remove the presence of artifacts without degrading the information in that image significantly. We can also do things that were otherwise impossible before, like taking an MR scan and trying to synthesize the appearance of a CT scan. So maybe we only have an MR and we want to make a treatment plan or update a treatment plan for a patient that has an MR. Well, then we can do the translation between the intensity values of that MR scan and the intensity values in CT. And this is actually very complicated because there isn't really a one-to-one translation between the two. An intensity value, a low intensity in MR could correspond to bone or air, both of which have very different values in CT. And to make that prediction, you need to have some contextual information. And that's where these convolutional neural networks really excel, because it can learn those patterns, and it can do it in a way that we actually don't have to supply it with anything other than just some images to get used to start to make these associations in terms of appearance. And as medical physicists, we actually don't have to be excellent computer programmers, because a lot of this kind of work, this development work, is done by other people for other applications, and we can adapt it to medical imaging. So a kind of synthetic neural network that we might use to make color images from black and white images, we can take that code, that sort of back end, and as long as we can get our medical data into the right format, we can use it to do that sort of same process, and we can synthesize images in the same way. And then one of the really cool applications, I think a lot of my work is in nuclear medicine, is in trying to automate quantitative extraction of data from medical images. So, you know, we can use AI to, instead of translating an image from one format to another, we can translate the image from its original data into labels, so correspond those voxels into a classification as a certain tissue type. We can use that for radiotherapy planning, of course. That's much more efficient. It might help to standardize the way those contours are drawn between different planners. But certainly we can now start to use that information to take measures of uptake from nuclear medicine scans. We can start to quantify the textures or radiomic scores of a number of other imaging modalities. And so this just means that we can start to automate measurements from large patient populations. And that, I think, was going to start to yield very exciting data. So maybe just subtle trends that we can use to improve the diagnostic capability of these images, but something that once we extract it at the very large scale may become quite powerful. So just to take an example of nuclear medicine and PET imaging. So if we wanted to, say, assess the tumor burden in a patient that's received a PET scan, we've got some collection of hotspots, which is going to be where the tracer accumulates. Typically, this is going to be a mix of physiological tissues and malignant zones. And by eye, you can see this fairly easily. And we can kind of design a couple AI methods that could tackle this problem. And that's really where things are kind of cool, because with AI, we can make these little rudimentary building blocks that allow us to take a complex challenge, differentiating all of these tissue types, and break it down into a number of discrete steps. So one thing we could do is we could say, okay, find each of these hot regions, and then we'll make a neural network that classifies them as benign or malignant. Another thing that we could do is we can look at a CT scan, which is ubiquitous in nuclear medicine, PET, radiology, radiotherapy, and we can use our AI contouring algorithm to find known physiological regions of uptake. So we can train an AI to contour, say, the kidneys or the bladder, the parotid glands in PSMA imaging. And once we've got that information about where those are, we can use that to delete, sort of remove, do a Boolean subtraction of those regions. And the remaining high uptake zones should be what we would classify as malignant uptake. So that means that we can kind of automatically assess the extent of disease in patients. We can assess not just, say, a maximum standardized uptake value, a maximum SUV value, but instead sort of the average SUV across this whole region, the number of individual lesions. And that makes our sort of PET imaging a much more powerful tool to track patients longitudinally, to designate if patients might be good candidates for a particular therapy. We can also use that information for radionuclide therapies, like looking at uptake to normal tissues, trying to correlate that to radiation dose and dose response, and potentially help to tailor treatment specifically to a patient's physiology. So just to walk you through that process, in this case, this is spleen, which we use for, it's a primary set of uptake in neuroendocrine treatments with lutetium octreotate. So often we're trying to differentiate between healthy uptake there. So we'll have sort of two stages of AI algorithm. Both of them are using a segmentation technique, a UNet, a fairly standard off-the-shelf, you can get the code from GitHub type of algorithm. One of them is just sort of optimized to find the centroid of the region of interest, because a patient's scan length can vary considerably. So we've got one that just sort of finds the right region. So that's our first sort of tool to have in the toolbox, is something that can find a region. And then subsequently we crop down, and we've got one that's trained to find the margins of that organ at a fairly good definition, and try to get that sort of voxel perfect. And that's the step. And then we can just repeat that process for any number of different organs. We just need, I don't know, in the order of 50, 100, sometimes 200 training cases, and then we can repeat this process over and over. So once we've got that pipeline for getting these training data and knowing how that we can feed that into these neural network algorithms, then what we get out of the other side is a label, an RT structure, something that we can use to make these kind of clinical measurements in real time or in sort of large scale. So if we look at the results, our automated contours are relatively similar in appearance to the manual ones. But most importantly, if we're looking at radiation dose, in this case to the kidneys, we see that the manual contours and automated ones track very similarly, and most importantly, the variation is between the two is much less than sort of the natural variation between cases that you'd see. So that means that we can use this to stratify patients quite reliably between those that are likely to have some sort of radiation toxicity versus those that aren't. And again, we can just expand that to a number of different organs, and then we can start to do this kind of large-scale data mining across a wider cohort of patients and start to look for trends. Just another quick use example. So this is one where we're looking at extent of skeletal muscle. Again, this is on CT, so we've trained an AI to segment or contour the skeletal area at the L3 vertebra. And again, this it doesn't take too much. It's a UNet. We feed in that data. It trains in an afternoon, and what you see is that it's quite reliably reproducing the manual values for data that it hasn't seen before. And then we've coupled that again with this sort of 3D UNet, so this can automatically find the right slice if we feed in a whole stack of CT images. And now all we need is any volumetric CT that encompasses the abdomen. We can get this sort of sarcopenia score, this sort of prognostic indicator of potentially how well they're going to respond to treatment. Yeah, and so I know this is quite a computational tool, but I think as medical physicists, we're well suited often to be involved in this. And this kind of goes in keeping with what Johan was saying, that you know, the people that develop the methods, they may not be as aware of the clinical problem. And often actually being able to squeeze the best possible network out of, you know, by making the perfect configuration of layers is less important than just being able to curate training data in a reasonable way, being able to understand sort of the imaging capabilities, what a scanner really shows, what are reasonable ways to augment it, things like that. And being entrenched in the hospital, you can train a network off a small pilot study, add in some more patients, see how it works, find the ones that didn't work in, add them in, and you get to develop a sort of much more efficient way of updating these neural networks than maybe if you were just given a big batch of challenge data and say, okay, do your best. So yeah, so just to say that being in medical physics, or really anyone that's in a hospital and sort of technologically minded, you're in a good place to try and implement these technologies yourself, and start to experiment it. Because, you know, it can be a project that you start from scratch, and in, you know, a month, 2 months, you have something that you can play around with, and you can actually try and validate your results on a real clinical task. Yeah, so just to summarize, I think that this is really exciting because you're starting to see a number of very powerful tools falling into our kind of image processing toolkit. I'd say like things like atlas segmentation have basically all gone by the wayside, and you know, you can see that you've got all of this this power, rather than having to do complex computations of image registration, staple, and so on. You can just feed in a bunch of images into this single algorithm, and it can make sense of it. And being able to implement that is going to, I think, change a lot of what we do in terms of image processing, and particularly just being able to couple some of these steps to other sort of rudimentary image processing tasks as well. I think, yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Thanks everyone for your time. I'll take sort of questions at the end, but yeah, thanks again. This is really fun to get to speak about.
Okay. Thank you, Price, very much. And our next speaker, Associate Professor Lois Holloway from the Ingham Institute for Applied Medical Research in Sydney, will take this one step further into the domain of clinical trials, and she will tell us how artificial intelligence can be actually currently implemented in clinical trials. Lois, over to you.
Thanks, Eva. It's great to be part of this discussion this evening, and really exciting to see how some of these areas are really changing how we do things in the clinic. And in this particular presentation, I'm going to focus on a number of areas that we've been looking at, in particular related to clinical trials and radiation oncology in clinical trials. So just some disclosures and acknowledgement of funding sources to start with. Much of this work's been funded by Australian government grants, and also the knowledge-based planning work that I'm going to present is funded from a Varian clinical research grant. So I think this has well been covered before, but kind of the Wikipedia definitions of artificial intelligence and data mining, the opportunity to take an environment and make actions that maximize the chance of successfully achieving the goals. And as Johan mentioned earlier, part of this is the challenge of working out what that environment is, and even what might appear simple in the first instance, what those goals are. And I think, as Price mentioned, one of the really key roles of a medical physicist sometimes is the ability to translate between that clinical knowledge and between some of the machine learning and data science knowledge. And I think we're in a really nice position to be involved in that work and to learn in both directions. And then data mining is the other definition that I've got here, which is really looking for patterns in large volumes of data that has been really hard to undertake with traditional approaches. So particularly for radiation oncology clinical trials, there are two areas that I want to look at. I'm going to spend most of my time actually focusing on the first of these, and there are two areas within that I want to talk about. And then finally, just sort of a brief glance looking at other areas that how we can support clinical trials. So looking at the development of tools to support clinical trials, and in particular their translation to the clinic. And I've taken this as an article that was in seminars in radiation oncology, looking at the use of big data for quality assurance in radiation therapy. And this is a general approach to radiation therapy, but it provides a really nice framework, which is the same framework that we're interested in from a clinical trials perspective. So we've got our data at the top of our chain, we've got our different extractions or feature extraction tools, and then different models that we can develop out of that. Importantly, we need our measures along the way. So looking for differences in our data that we might be interested in, looking at particularly quality metrics, and that's one of the things that we're really interested in clinical trials, and obviously our outcome measures. And when we can link all of these things together, then we have the potential to really learn a lot and perhaps change how we do things. So looking at that pathway, I want to focus on two of those, the contour QA and the plan QA. So contour QA, for those of you that are in radiotherapy space, I'm sure you're very aware of how critical QA is in radiation oncology and in our outcomes. This is a study that was presented quite a number of years ago now. It was a TROG study looking at a head and neck cancer population and looking for the difference with some chemotherapy drugs. In the end, the trial didn't show a difference between the two arms that were considered. But on going back retrospectively and looking at the data, they saw quite a dramatic difference between plans and cases where the trial protocol was followed and cases where the trial protocol was not followed. And they saw that difference in overall survival outcomes. So on this graph, you can see the red curve at the bottom, and these were the instances where the protocol was not followed, and these patients didn't do anywhere near as well as the patients where the protocol was followed. And within this study, one of the most serious protocol breaches was incorrect target definition. The practicalities of actually assessing target definition, or how we define our volumes within clinical trials, can be incredibly time consuming. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, we're starting with our images, we're delineating this, or our clinicians are delineating this. And then what we want to be able to do is to review those delineations before our patient gets onto the treatment couch. And so this process requires an expert in this area to be able to review those. They need to do this in a timely fashion, and we need to be able to act on that before the patient gets onto the treatment couch. So we've done some development work looking at a tool in order to undertake some of these QA processes to try and be able to assess these contours in much the same way that Price did, looking at segmentation in the previous presentation. And we're looking here for the ability to determine whether our contours are acceptable, whether they're not acceptable, or if our machine learning approach is not adequate, then to be able to say we don't have confidence in this model and we need to be able to look at this manually. So we've considered this for a few different areas, but one of these is for the PROMETHEUS clinical trial, which is a prostate data set. And you can see here what we did was took an initial data set of prostate patients that had been treated, and then we had our inter-observers, or our multiple clinicians contours. So we got that range of breadth from that. And then we set up an automated system for being able to segment those contours, and an atlas that we could then generate on each of the structures we were interested in. The practicalities of this are that we can then see and predict where our expert range would have been. So you can see here in the top images that we have the green line and the cyan line that sort of represent the extremes of where we think our experts would have contoured. And in this instance, it's a bit hard to see, but there's a dark blue manual contour there. And that's the contour that was submitted, if you like, for that particular patient. And we can display that in a number of different ways. And one of the challenges in this space is going to be how we present this information. You can see the images on the bottom row where we've used a grayscale, and you can see the smear in some regions where the experts were showing more variation from each other, but this was still considered acceptable within the knowledge that was available at time, and other instances where it's almost a black to white contrast change, where all the clinicians were agreed that this is exactly where this should be. And this is potentially a tool that we could use in future clinical trials to make sure that we can improve that. Associated with that, we can also look at the changes in dosimetry around that. And that also gives us the ability to look at these ranges of variation. And then when we undertake our machine learning models to try and learn even more from this data, we can also take this uncertainty into account. And that's really important. One of the other challenges within clinical trials is plan quality QA. So once we've got our delineations or our contours correct, then how do we make sure that we have an acceptable plan? And how do we manage the variation in plans potentially across departments? So some of you may have already come across the concept of knowledge-based planning, or again, learning from previous treatment plans in order to work out what the best treatment plan might be achievable for the particular patient that you have in front of you at the time. And so this approach utilises a library of previous plans with variations in geometry, variations in anatomy across patients. And then from that, to be able to predict what a likely best DVH would be. And so then we can use these likely best DVHs to assess whether perhaps the plan that we've got in front of us is as good as it possibly could be, or whether there is room for improvement. So the use of this has been tested out in a study that Nick Hardcastle's leading as part of the TRAC trial, which is a stereotactic trial for cancers of the kidney. I won't go into the details of the trial. For those of you that are keen, you can see them here. But part of the challenge is how we ensure that we have these treatment plans that are deliverable and that we get the most effective treatment plan for the patient in question. So for a knowledge-based planning approach, the initial model was developed and refined within Verjans' rapid plan. And then for each new plan, a knowledge-based plan was created as part of the trial QA process. And then this knowledge-based plan was compared with the plan that was submitted from the centre that was recruiting the patient. If the knowledge-based plan was superior by more than 10% for the metrics that they were considering, then the request was made for the particular plan to be replanned to ensure that there was consistency across plans and also the ability to improve where feasible. And this is sort of some of the reports that were generated in this. So for the various contours that you can see there, and variations between what was seen in the plans that were submitted and the knowledge-based plans. In this particular instance, replanning after having that knowledge-based feedback certainly improved the small bowel criteria. And when they looked across the number of patients that were involved in the study and looked at the benefits of having this knowledge-based planning approach, there was improvement across a number of different dose metrics for approximately half of the patients that were considered. So at the very least, we were improving plans for those individual patients, but also ensuring consistency. This is a study that's been published in Radiotherapy and Oncology, and it's an ROTC study and a DeHunker study. And this just shows a really nice graphic of the image on the left. You can see how tight these are mean dose metrics you can see here. But really this is showing how the spread within the trial across those dose metrics is seen on the right-hand side when each centre is just left to their own scenarios in that space. And on the left-hand side, you can see how much tighter that gets. So when we're looking at using AI for clinical trial QA, we think it's quite feasible to use this for contour QA, for training off our clinicians' consistency, and for understanding our clinical questions. And knowledge-based planning has demonstrated the possibility for improving that consistency and quality in trial plans. And I think AI has the potential to dramatically improve how we conduct those trials, both in terms of workflow as well as quality. But as with all of these things, we need to consider them very carefully. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lois. That is greatly appreciated. I would like to welcome now to the discussion Dr. Jonathan Sykes, who is a lead radiation oncology medical physicist in research at Sydney Westcare Cancer Network. And the remaining time of the webinar, we will have a panel discussion as well as answering some questions from the participants. And Jonathan, I will start with you. How do you see the relevance of artificial intelligence to medicine?
Thanks, Eva. And firstly, thanks for inviting me to join in this discussion. Very exciting. I think AI is highly relevant to medicine. The distinct advantage that AI has over the human brain is to be able to quickly compute relationships from very large and complex data sets and to continue to learn as new data becomes available. And medicine and healthcare in general is full of complexity, and there are many examples where AI is already showing great promise, and you've seen some of those examples from Price and Lois, and there are many, many more in the literature. But I think what really brought this home to me is when I heard about Tesla's self-driving cars. Now, obviously, these self-driving algorithms required extensive training before they could be released onto the road. But in June this year, one of these Tesla cars crashed into an overturned truck because it had not yet been trained to recognize an overturned truck. And I guess this is one of several instances where a Tesla car has crashed because the algorithm had not been trained to recognize a particular situation or scene. But what I think is truly amazing is that for every such incident, the algorithm is retrained and then distributed to all the Tesla cars that are on the road via a mobile network overnight. So now all these cars have learned to deal with that overturned truck and hopefully avoiding a similar crash. So, you know, imagine this kind of learning in medicine. Imagine every healthcare professional having access at their fingertips to the treatment outcomes of every patient case across the world to help them with diagnosis or decisions to treat. I mean, this is, you know, very futuristic, I think, and will require lots of, you know, a lot of research to get there, and a lot of smaller artificial intelligence algorithms building up to this grand vision, I guess. So, but a single medical practitioner relies on what they have learned from their training, and that's knowledge passed down from experts in the field, and then, you know, who have trained them, and then continuous professional development in the form of updates from courses, conferences, journal articles, and books. And then this is blended with their own personal experience of treating patients. So while the medical practitioners are amazing people and have highly specialized knowledge, they are limited in their personal experience, their own unique interpretations of knowledge, and even the reliability of their own memory. And in addition, they are limited by the number of factors that they can use to make these decisions. So if they had an artificially intelligent assistant trained on the healthcare records, including imaging, pathology, molecular profiling, genetics, proteomics, treatment prescriptions and plans, toxicity data, treatment responses, a wealth of data, then the AI assistant could provide the practitioner and the patient with up-to-date information on the various treatment options, including what the probabilities for success are, the likelihood of toxicities, and all this personalized to the characteristics of the individual patient.
Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. So I don't think anyone would argue that the artificial intelligence can grossly enhance the capacity for delivery of better precision and better personalized medicine. But the question is, how do we implement artificial intelligence into our practice safely? How do we validate it? Lois, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly challenging question in many instances, and a really, really important one. I think the basic principle to be really aware of with any machine learning approaches is the fact that we need to be able to validate these models on a completely independent data set. There is a paper and it's a statement on how we consider these models, and it's called the tripod statement, which you can find in a Google Scholar search pretty easily. And that provides a really nice framework. There are others as well, but a really nice framework in terms of considering how we validate these models. And the highest quality of model is a model that's been developed on one data set and then validated on a completely independent data set. And we've done some of this work with models that have been developed in Europe and then validated on Australian data. So quite separate to that. The other thing that's really important is that as we use these models in an ongoing fashion, that we're aware of other changes that might be outside our immediate knowledge. So in radiotherapy, for instance, we might be using models on a particular imaging data set from radiotherapy, but unbeknownst to us, there might be changes to the immunotherapy drugs, or there might be changes to the chemotherapy drugs. And what happens is that that effectively changes the cohort of patients that are coming through our doors, and then perhaps these models are no longer relevant. So it's really important that we are actively engaged with our clinicians, and that we are understanding what's happening in that space, but also that we have these ongoing QA processes to be able to validate these models as things are going to change over time, invariably.
Just like that overturned TRAC.
Exactly.
Yeah, Johan, can I ask you, what are the barriers and enablers to implement AI into clinical practice? You are a clinician on the panel.
Yes, yeah, there's still, just to start, there's a lot of promise, but there's, fortunately for the younger career people, there's a lot of research to be done. There's barriers and enablers on every single level. So we've talked a lot about the interaction and engagement. I think it starts and ends with the data. So the barriers are data and quality of data. I have had many conversations with people who had a good idea and potentially were going to have the data. and that's where the project ended. Enablers are people who give their data, make their data available to a certain project, but also to the world. So I think what is important that the imaging world and also radiation therapy, all the world that is sitting on large image and annotated image data sets actually in radiation therapy, which is interesting, actually are still very conservative in keeping their data sets to themselves. So the example from genomics world is really important to learn from, because there was a lot of blood, sweat and tears, especially blood, to acquire genomics data for a certain problem. but it took a long time before people realized that actually the value of the data set was only there when combined. So the same goes for data sets, because AI can be fooled quite easily. So validation in different cohorts, in different scanners, in different settings is crucial for this, and continuous audit. Enablers will be continuous audit, because if AI makes a big mistake, like in gene therapy we've seen, there will be a backlash in approvals and acceptance in clinical practice. Data annotation is mostly still a barrier, maybe not in radiation therapy because you draw a lot of circles there, but in a lot of fields there's cardiologists, by the way, too, there's a lot of data set that need annotation and high quality annotation, and there's only a handful of companies doing that, but they do it expensively, and I think we can do that as long as we make it a crowd source effort. And then barriers and enablers in terms of machine learning methods, I think UNet is a really nice model that enabled machine learning for the rest of the world. But if I talk to my scientists in my institute, they actually wonder, why is everybody using that inferior network in medicine? Because there's many other networks. So we need to communicate and also know what we should use, but also have a user-friendly tool, which is UNet. In the case of UNet, needs to be set for that. So in terms of engagement, data annotation, and machine learning methods, there's various barriers and enablers. Mostly barriers, but a lot of promising enablers.
Thank you so much. Price, there are lots of questions coming through about how to educate medical physicists in our case in being able to conduct machine learning and artificial intelligence. How do we implement it in our standard training and education? Could you comment, please?
Yeah. I think it's a good point. I don't know that it's necessarily a concept that everyone needs to be an expert at. It's probably worth understanding the basics in the same way that now if you're using a deformable registration algorithm, there may be some people in the radiotherapy department that know it very well, but everyone should sort of understand what this black box does and what some of the potential limitations are. And I think that's a good example where we can kind of see now in the medical physics community how we're building the training program and building the kind of groups that make a standard and say this is what competencies should be addressed, and how we need to take care when implementing it in the clinic, because there's clearly an upside to it. It offers some better ways that we can use, adapt plans to treatment and so on, and map dose. But there's also risks involved, and so that may be a good example to look at in terms of that. In terms of like becoming a very competent researcher in AI methods, I don't think I'm even that, but I can look on GitHub and find some code, and I think that the barrier to doing that is actually very low. So if you want to develop these kind of techniques and tools, like that barrier is not that high if you're just trying to make some tools that give new capabilities that don't necessarily have the clinical risks associated. It's just it's going to give you some potential data for research purposes.
Yeah. And I presume that we don't have to be experts in everything, and this is where that opportunity for collaboration is, where you will have a team of different scientists, everyone bringing that expertise, whether mathematical, computational, physics, or clinical together, and as a team you can progress that area further. Jonathan, do you think that when a group is starting a program or an institute, that's also for Johan, you should start concentrating on one area like radiology or nuclear medicine or cardiology, or should you have multiple teams looking at the different aspects of AI?
Well, I guess that depends what sort of institution you're working in. I think for myself, working as a radiation therapy medical physicist, I would want to concentrate with applications within my area and build that expertise. But I guess working in a wider healthcare environment, be aware of what other research is going on around me and how you can collaborate and learn from others.
Yeah, Johan, would you like to comment?
Yeah, so I think you don't need to be fortunate that you have a decade-long machine learning institute that went through all the AI winters and everything. I think in every specialty there are groups developing things and expertise, and you just need to bring them together, and that will already create a lot of cool interaction. And also what I said, that people can ask their questions and not reinvent the wheel in 3 months, what could have, just be some code that you got from somebody. So just look around and engage, and maybe, organize an AI and healthcare day, and just try and find people who give lectures, and then the engagement starts.
Yeah, thank you. Lois, let's say, as based on your presentation, you have an AI-based treatment planning system. How do you commission such a treatment planning system, perhaps purchased from a vendor, into clinical practice? And how do you ensure ongoing quality assurance on it?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge that we're all kind of starting to face in this space. And I think no different to the other quality assurance processes that we take. We need to take a really careful look at what the risks are for the particular instance that we might be using it. So in the knowledge-based planning approach, the plan that we're ending up with is still a plan that's undergoing all of exactly the same quality assurance approaches that we would be using in standard clinical practice. So in that instance, I would suggest that the relative risk of using that approach is actually reasonably low. Now, we still need to understand what's happening in that algorithm, but in terms of the end impacts, we're relatively safe. In instances where we're using these algorithms to make clinical decisions, and they really are black boxes in that we don't necessarily understand exactly how the algorithm is using that information, and that changes the treatment approach for a patient, then I think that becomes much more challenging. And as a community, I think we're still kind of grappling with how we deal with that. And that still requires the clinician to look at that very carefully to what their trained decision will be. And it will be interesting to see how that changes over time. There's also a lot of work going on with machine learning methodologies to really try and tease the information out of the black box, if you like, so that we can explain what the influencing factors have been on this decision, and then clinicians can look at those influencing factors and say, well, yes, that makes sense, or that doesn't make sense. And I think that's really important in that instance.
Price, question for you. You were showing an examples from PET-CT, but I presume you can apply your methodology to SPECT-CT images as well?
Yeah. So we've kind of taken the approach to do everything based on CT. All of the AI methods are essentially applied to the CT, which has the advantage of then we can use it for radiology, or we can use it for our RT planning stuff. And because then also we don't have to adapt it if we've got a PET scan with FDG versus a gallium nitrate or gallium PSMA, then you know if you're training on that PET component, you have to then probably adapt the methods to it. So it's nice that the universal here, CT, is ubiquitous to SPECT and PET, and so we just take the organ contours from that, and then as far as we can use like a typical kind of SUV threshold. I saw that question's going through. You can use some PROSIS kind of segmentation to find SUV thresholds, and then the rest of it is just removing the AI generated contours from CT.
Thank you. Johan, in regards to your barriers and enablers, how do you ensure that when we have data sharing, the images remain anonymous? And how do we educate facilities on what does and does not constitute genuine risks to privacy of data so that they can be shared between institutions?
Well, I think on a national level there need to be guidelines and rules that need to be clear and transparent. It's a difficult discussion because some data can be derived. You know, there's groups having an MRI scan, they can create faces from an MRI scan that is identifiable, and also I think there's sometimes that people don't realize there's still identifiable data in DICOMs. So on all the different levels of anonymization, there needs to be a process that is clear and transparent. And yeah, in my ideal world, you know, if we use clinical data, every patient would own his data and actually see how it has been used, because then you don't have to create a police to police it, but people can police their own data and actually block it and etc. But you know, there's a few countries that have systems like this, but we're still a little bit far away. So there needs to be national guidance, because everybody's trying out to maybe an international guidance actually, to just have a consensus on this, and that's where it starts. And then, yeah, I cannot go into all the aspects, but I think that's where it starts, and it will never be perfect. Like any data, it cannot be perfect, unfortunately, but I think it can be perfect enough to improve healthcare and save costs, and that's helping everyone.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, a question has been posted whether you can use AI for IMRT and VMAT planning.
Oh, I can't say I'm an expert in this area. I'm sorry. Look, you know, I think if you look in the literature, there are people who have used AI techniques to develop IMRT and to do optimization, but I'm definitely not an expert in that area.
Lois, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of work in that space, in different components of that chain. So in the knowledge-based planning space, you're kind of taking complete plans and then looking at predicting what's there. There's also work in that space looking at the different optimization algorithms and how we might tackle that, how we combine plans. I think there's plenty of opportunity in those areas, and certainly areas that the commercial vendors are already looking at.
Yeah, I would like to read a comment from Spencer Welland. It's important to remember that in general, as physicists, we do not need to be experts in AI and do not need to worry about developing groundbreaking algorithms. There are students and researchers that are doing this for generalized processes. What we need to be experts in is adapting those generalized models to the clinical environment. And I think this has summarized where we as medical physicists or maybe clinicians sit in regards to artificial intelligence. It's really looking for those specific applications to the problems in your clinics. Okay, Johan, can I ask you for a concluding remark, and then I will close the meeting because we have run out of time.
I think I like to repeat just that we need to change the imaging culture, that we should share in a safe way. And I totally agree that like cardiologists, we have our physics course to become a certain level physicist, to understand, and that's a great parallel to AI. You need to understand the potential and the limitations. I almost agree with the previous statement. I only believe that the application and the clinical implementation of these generalized models probably requires still an intermediate person because otherwise you need to know a lot to actually the fine-tuning. Everybody can use an off-the-shelf algorithm, but the fine-tuning, that's where the art and the experience is needed, and that's where we need to be multidisciplinary and collaborative.
Yeah, and we want to avoid using AI as black boxes, because if you don't understand what it's doing, that's a potential for an error to happen.
I partially agree, but I think also there has to be an acceptance within clinicians that there's going to be a new paradigm. So if we have a little algorithm that predicts risk in any disease, there's risk scores. We don't know the formula by heart. So that's it's almost a black box, because we trust the formula to be based on the data. So I think the paradigm changes also is just to accept that sometimes it is able to predict, as long as we verify this over and over and over, and also accept that it will make mistakes like humans.
Wonderful. So I would like to thank our wonderful speakers and panelists for a wonderful late evening in Australia, because in Sydney it would be 11 p.m. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and research with nearly 500 participants. Before I close the meeting, I would like to just let our colleagues know that the next international webinar will be held on 17th of August, and the speaker will be Professor Colin Otter, who might be known to many, and he will be talking on the importance of certification and accreditation in medical physics. So another excellent lecture. So please join me all in thanking our tonight's speakers, and good night, good day, good morning to all of you. Thank you.